we began this journey talking about character and how that is such a foundational idea in the process of spiritual formation. And then we jumped right into John Wesley's utmost priority, which is the love of God as the first mark, that love which is shed abroad in our hearts. And so now we get to the second mark, which is that a Methodist rejoices in God. And that word rejoice seems to be related in many ways to the idea of joy.
Yes.
So what do you think joy means in this context, and perhaps in what ways have you experienced joy in your own life?
Now, let me answer the last part and move back to the bigger question. As I said, love came alive for me and Jeannie.
Your wife.
My wife.
That's right.
Joy came alive for me when I looked through the nursery window and saw my children. In fact, in some ways, and without getting too graphic, that joy was the product of our love. The fact that we loved each other, you see, and were able, the way God's made us, to have children. But you go through all the 9 months and you look at the sonograms and you put your hand on the tummy and you feel the baby kicking and all that stuff. But there's still that moment. It happened in both of our children. When the nurse comes in and says, here's your son, here's your daughter. And that's as close as I've ever come in my life with feeling that this is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. This is my beloved daughter in whom I'm well pleased. That was a moment of joy, which even Jeannie was not participating in that very moment because she was in another part of the hospital. But there was that moment when, a few hours later, when they opened those curtains and there he was, there she was. And in some ways, to take that and go back to where you started, I think joy is the mark that enables us to know we have experienced love. What kind of response are you going to have to love other than, wow, this joy moment when, and especially when we step back from some of the moments of our lives and realize we got love when we didn't deserve it, or we got love anyway. That creates joy. And that's what I think Wesley's getting at. It's the second mark, but it's also the evidence that the love of God has in fact been shed abroad in our heart.
Love and joy go hand in hand in many ways, which is why they're number one and number two right off the top.
I think so.
And if love, the way we discussed it last time, is more than just a singular moment in time, but a lifelong process, just like when you and Jeannie first fell in love, you've learned to love each other as a process.
That's right.
Perhaps joy is the same thing, that the experience of joy is not a singular moment in time. It is perhaps most profoundly experienced, like when your children were born.
Absolutely.
But joy is also a journey in some ways, isn't it?
Yes.
Oh, and one of the ways to maybe unpack that even further is to differentiate between joy and fleeting emotions such as happiness, ecstasy, thrills. All of those were at work when your children were born. But to some degree, a lot of that faded as you settled into the realities of what it meant to be a father for the long haul. So what is it about joy that is enduring, even through suffering, through dark times, through tough times? What does joy mean in those contexts?
Okay, well, there's one of those words I want to lift out and not jettison, and that's happiness. It's interesting that in Wesley's explanatory notes on the New Testament, he translates the Beatitudes as happy. Yeah, not blessed. He changes it to happy. And when I began to explore that, I thought to myself, what's he drawing on there? And what he's drawing on is an ancient philosophical and theological understanding that holiness and happiness go together. And one of the things that bothered him as a young man and throughout the Methodist movement was that he saw people professing to be holy, but they weren't happy. And so he called sour godliness as the devil's religion. Now, it is true, McGray, that we have counterfeited the word happy in every generation. No doubt about that. But I think Wesley would want us to hold on to happy and joy and not necessarily think that one was not the other. The other things about fleeting moments and ecstasies and confusing the part for the whole, that's what we talked about in one of our previous conversations, is that we just don't want to see well, we don't want to begin to judge our life by whether or not we had a good day.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways I see it.
Well, as I think about those times in my life that I might identify as being in a state of joy, I actually don't think about moments of ecstasy or thrill.
That's interesting, yeah.
I actually think of those moments when, after having taken stock of what God has been doing in my life, there have been moments when I can say that I felt like I'm doing what God wants me to do.
Yeah.
I'm in the place where God wants me to be.
That's right.
And the lot in which I find myself in life is where God wants me to be.
Exactly.
Even with all of the tough stuff, the dark stuff, the difficult stuff. And having taken stock of all of those things, I feel a contentment.
Yes.
I can't say that that happens all the time, but what's profound to me
Big picture,
is that
yeah.
that joy happens in the midst of life's difficulties.
does.
And I wonder, back to your point, why Wesley would have put number 2 right next to number 3. Rejoicing in God goes hand in hand with giving thanks.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. It's the seed bed for gratitude.
Right.
Sure it is.
Right.
I mean, what can you give thanks for if you don't think anything good's going on in your life?
That's right. That's right. That's right. And I think of James when he
Yeah.
says, "Consider it all joy
Yeah.
when you encounter various
Yeah.
trials."
Yeah.
That the sufferings in life do not negate joy. In some ways, they probably illuminate the joy that is ours, right?
There's so many ways to try to say it, but I think joy is the fallback plan on a bad day. Joy is what you've got left when you don't have anything left. You know, when all this stuff you tried and it just didn't. Joy abides in the sense that I'm as joyful to have John as my son. He's your age. He's 42. I'm as joyful to have John as my son today as it was the day he was born. I'm as joyful to have my daughter Katrina to be my daughter now as the day she was born. The abiding joy is all of those days, but they're as alive in the present as they were in the past, even though not all of them were equally joyful. And that's reality, and one of the things I've said for years is spirituality is reality. Don't get me into a la-la land about these 5 marks to where you have to be a super person that runs faster than a speeding bullet and leaps tall buildings in a single bound to even be able to do them. Mix that in with the days when you have to say, I shouldn't have said that, I'm sorry I did that, forgive me. These marks are floating and working in the midst of the days of our lives.
Right.
And it's when you step back, you get the abiding sense of them.
Yeah, and the liberating word for this is that just like love, the love of God is not something that we initiate.
Absolutely.
Neither is joy.
That's why I want to face joy toward mark number 1 first, before I face it toward number 5.
That's right.
See? Absolutely.
Because if our state of joy or rejoicing in God is contingent upon our ability to initiate it, oftentimes we're in no position, just given the difficulties of life, to generate that kind of response.
There are times when your soul's not full.
Yeah.
Period.
So it is a response. It's
The worst thing in the
response to
world
God.
would be to try to fulfill these marks, to try to overflow in these marks when you're half full. That just becomes pretense.
Well, the other way to turn rejoicing back to loving is that when we talked about loving, we talked about how we don't necessarily want to love God in a way that turns God into a palsy-walsy God.
That's right.
And so it goes with rejoicing, too.
Yes.
Oftentimes, when I pray, I have to catch myself that I don't rejoice in God in a way that is entirely egotistically.
Oh, absolutely.
In other words, I have to be careful not to rejoice in God simply because of what God has done for me or who God is to me.
Yep.
And I have to, it's difficult sometimes,
Yeah, it is.
but I have to recalibrate the way I rejoice in God simply to appreciate God for who God is.
That's right. The place where I go for that, I think it's in Hebrews. I'm not good with chapters and verses, but it's where, speaking of Jesus, it says, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. There are people in Christianity today who wouldn't write that verse that way. They'd say, unless there's a chicken in every pot, and unless, your bank account's always black, unless you're prospering in every way, there's no joy. Hebrews says there was joy set before Jesus, and the cross was between him and that joy. That's a different kind of joy.
Right.
That's a joy that's rooted in something deeper than the moment.
Right. Right. Right.
It's rooted in purpose, in mission, why you think you've been put on the earth in the first place. And, you know, when most of the time I feel like I'm in the way and not on the way, you know, but boy, when you feel like you're on the way, that's joyful.
Yeah.
To have the only life we're going to live on this earth and live it for the glory of God, you can't beat that. That's joy.
So the love of God is independent of our initiative. It's always a response to God's love. Rejoicing in God is independent of our circumstances because it's always in response to a God who loves us all the time.
I like the way you're saying that.
And so these two go hand in hand.
Yeah, they do.
Are there any other final words that you would offer to sum up or expand on what it means for a Methodist to rejoice in God?
The only other thing I think would be the fact that this joy can follow you all the days of your life. I'm 67, and unless I'm going to live to be 134, I'm not having a midlife crisis today. David wrote the 37th Psalm when he was old, and he said, I've never seen the righteous forsaken. I've seen the righteous have bad days. I've seen the righteous have things happen to them that never should have happened, but forsaken. And I guess I would just bear witness back to you, McGray. You know, stay on the path, man. 42 to 67, what's that, 25 years? Hang in there, because the joy of the Lord is your strength from start to finish, from first breath to last. And somehow, I think when we get older, that's a precious gift to be able to claim.
That's a great word. I appreciate that, Steve. Thanks so much.